Welcome to this week's podcast. I'm Tim Weigel, team leader with the Lake Erie Regional Grape Program and statewide grape and hops IPM specialist with the New York State IPM program. And with me is my colleague Andy Musa, who is the Erie County, Pennsylvania component of the Lake Erie Grape Program. And we covered from bud swell to 3 to 6 inch shoot growth, and with this one, that one started getting a little long, so with this one we're going to concentrate mainly on insects that are around at 3 to 5 inches of shoot growth. So what are we looking for, Andy?
Well, at that point we start to look for between the 3 to 5 inch, probably closer to the 5 to 6 inch stage. Start looking for what's called the banded grape bug, or the Lygocorus inconspicuous.
Yes.
I think that's how you pronounce it.
They're
They're two of the insects that you'd start looking for at that time. And again, that goes a little bit later. Probably you would look for these anywhere from there till maybe the pre-bloom before they...
Yeah, I think 10 to 12 inches
would
really
be the last
cut off when you start, yeah.
Okay, so that would be the time you start looking for those. And as far as scouting for those, I would say you look for those on the shoots, towards the shoot tips, and maybe in the flower clusters as they start to form. And in fact, I don't know, you can go into, we do have a YouTube video.
Right, we have a video on how to scout for banded grape bug. Andy has some of the best eyes in the business as far as finding insects and insect eggs in grapes. I am not as gifted as he is, so what I do is I take a white paper plate and go out and actually tap the shoot and capture anything that falls. And it's very easy to tell. The banded grape bug is a little green bug, and the reason it's called banded is its antennae are black and white bands. And the Lygocorus inconspicuous is very similar to the banded grape bug, but it's all green, which helps it blend in. But one of the reasons that we're concerned about this and we're looking for them so early in the season is because they feed directly on the florets of the cluster. And so they can lead to quite a bit of crop loss if they aren't found and controlled early on.
And the feeding stage is the nymph of both
Yeah.
either the banded grape bug or the Lygocorus. The nymphal stage will feed on either the florets themselves or on the rachis. And at that point, these flower buds and the rachises and clusters are pretty small. They haven't formed yet. So as Tim said, again, a lot of times this isn't widespread throughout a vineyard block. That's why, again, scouting is important. But they can cause a lot of economic injury. And in fact, one nymph per 10 shoots, if you're out there scouting, is enough to actually cause economic injury. So it might not be widespread throughout your vineyard blocks, but you definitely have to scout for it because, again, it can cause economic injury. And if you're not out there scouting for it, you may be surprised if you have it later on.
Yeah, I mean, if you're running the harvester through the vineyard and you hit a spot and you go, there's no grapes here, what's going on? Banded grape bug might be one of the reasons, and you haven't had grapes there all year long because there weren't the florets there to get pollinated and form fruit.
Now, one of the things I would like to mention is as they reach adulthood, they're no longer a problem in grapes, and they won't feed on your clusters once they get to the adult stage. But that's usually
They actually
later in the
become
season.
beneficial.
Beneficial.
They're feeding on soft-bodied insects like aphids and so.
The next pest, what you might see at that time,
Yeah.
grape plume moth. And again, to me, they're interesting, but again, it's not one of these pests that I would consider a major pest. But of course, any pest you have in your vineyard specifically, and if it's at high enough levels, you probably consider a major pest. But these again are depending on the season and depending on your block and where it's located. Usually where you're going to find them again is border rows next to the woods. At least that's where I've found them the most.
Right.
And what they'll do is they'll sort of web leaves together, and the larvae of the moth will feed inside those leaves. And I've never seen, at least in Concord vineyards up here in the Lake Erie region, where it would be economically worthwhile to spray for these insects.
Yeah, I think usually by the time you see them,
that.
you see the leaves that are folded over, the larva's inside the leaves, and we don't have any insecticides that are
No.
able to penetrate that and take care of them anyway. So the thing that we've recommended in the past is if you see something like that, you recognize it as great plume moth. You can't do anything about it this year, but you can write it down on your map, your scouting records. So when you go into the dormant season, and we talked about reviewing what happened, you can look at that and say, okay, it looks like I had a problem. You can also go into NUA and start developing a database of degree days and say, hey, I had plume moth this year, I haven't seen it before, and what's different? This year we had X number of degree days by this date, which means it was a warmer than normal year. So maybe when those conditions occur again, I need to be out looking for plume moth a little bit earlier if it starts to become a huge problem.
And I guess there has been, and I think in the Finger Lakes, there has been some exceptions. I think Greg Loeb has done a lot of work with the great plume moth. And again, it's not that common, but they did have found exceptions where I think they said when you're out scouting 20%,
Yeah.
more than 20% of the shoots,
Yeah.
then that might actually kick in where it might be cause an economic loss.
Yeah.
And you might want to spray at that time. But like you said, having the records, going into NUA, figuring out, okay, so it'd probably be the season after you've
Correct, yeah.
discovered that, hey, yeah, I have that problem, go back the next season with that information, and then you may have to spray.
Yeah, and I think part of that, what they found, was that typically the plume moth is folding the leaves up by the shoot tip, but when populations get high enough, then you start getting some accidental folding around clusters. And
That's
then
where-
they will feed directly on the clusters if that happens. They typically don't, but if populations get high enough, then you're going to lose some clusters in the feeding process.
Now, the only other thing I know that in the guide, and we don't have as much a problem up in the Lake Erie region, but I know more so on Long Island, Finger Lakes, and probably down in southeastern PA and areas further south. At this time, you probably all should be looking at for maybe European red mite and two-spotted spider mite. Again, usually they don't get going till later in the season, but if you have them that, you should be looking, and if you have them that earlier, they could really be a problem. And you should be scouting at that point. And if you've got economic injury levels high enough, or if you get bronzing this early, then you're in trouble.
Right. And
That's
miticides
hot.
are expensive,
Yeah.
so the earlier you can catch populations, the better off you are. And I find it interesting, when I came back in 1989, they were still talking about the spider mites that were in Concord vineyards. They
Yeah.
went away. We don't know why, but there's always the chance that they'll come back. So
And that was really the only time that I saw any problems with European red mite up here and bronzing. But
Yeah.
that was a while ago. But again, areas like Finger Lakes, Long Island, and southeastern PA,
they have to deal with
they
it.
have to deal with
Yeah.
mite problems more so than we do up here in the Lake Erie region.
Yeah. All right. So that wraps up this week's podcast. If you have any questions, if you have suggestions for future podcasts, please leave them in the comment section below.